Good morning, family. There is a magazine published by the U.S. Naval Institute called the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. And in it, a man named Frank Koch told this story about communication between vessels at sea. He said, two battleships assigned to a training squadron had been at sea on maneuvers in heavy weather for several days. And then he writes, I was serving on the lead battleship and was on watch on the bridge as night fell. And the visibility was poor with patchy fog, so the captain remained on the bridge, keeping an eye on all the activities. Shortly after dark, the lookout on the wing reported, light bearing on the starboard bow. And the captain called out, is it steady? Or is it moving astern? And the lookout replied, steady, Captain, which meant that we were on a collision course, a dangerous collision course with that source of light, that ship. So the captain then called to the signalman, signal that ship and say, we are on a collision course. Advise you change course by 20 degrees. Back came the signal, advisable for you to change course 20 degrees. The captain put off, said, send this. I am a captain. Change course 20 degrees. The reply, I'm a seaman, second class. You had better change course 20 degrees. By that time, the captain was furious. So he spat out, send him this. I'm a battleship. Change course 20 degrees. Back came the signal, I'm a lighthouse, and we changed course. As human beings, like we experience stuff like this same dynamic. We experience this all the time, right? As human beings, we struggle with authority. When we feel like we have the right, when we feel like we have the position, whether it's like earned authority or positional authority, when we feel like, hey, this is my ground, this is my thing. I'm in charge here. This is my space. I get to call the shots. I get to, as Anna was talking about before, I have choice, and this is my choice. Don't infringe, don't tell me what to do. Get off my turf. And when we feel like our turf is being encroached upon, when we feel like our authority is being questioned, we tend to rear up, don't we? And we tend to aim to protect our right. We want to protect our authority, or we try to flex it and push back in order that no ground would be given up. And in the passage that we're about to study, in Luke chapter 20, so turn there. In the passage we're about to study in Luke 20, we're going to have a front row seat to that very dynamic as it's being played out in the authority of the religious leaders of the day and Jesus, our Savior, who's coming into the most important week, I would say the most important week of his life, but as we've said before, the most important week in the life of the most important man who's ever lived. This is the most important week of history. And here things are heating up. They're coming to a head in this really unique clash of power, a question of authority. Now, we've been studying our way through the book of Luke for over a year now. And so let me just summarize it by saying this. In the very first section of Luke, the first, I would say, 9 chapters, up into chapter 9, verse 51, there's a key turn. Chapter 9, verse 51 is when it says, and Jesus turned his face like a flint, set his face like a flint toward Jerusalem. At that point, things fundamentally changed. But that first section of the book of Luke is trying to basically describe and to defend who Jesus is, and he's appealing to the mind, right? And so he's trying to make a case and say, this is him, this is who he is to the Jewish people, this is who he is to the world, this is his character, this is who he is. He's appealing to the mind in the first section. In the second section, he's really appealing to the will, and he's saying, okay, this is what it means to actually follow him. And I'm going to tell you all these stories about people who are kind of getting on board and following him, and this band of motley followers that are going to like accrue around him. And now finally, he heads to Jerusalem. Those followers, probably hundreds of them, are now with him, following him into the city, through the city gates, into Jerusalem. And now this last third of the book, and the entire rest of the book, we still have a third of the book ahead of us, and it's only the last 7 days of his life before his crucifixion. So this last third of the book, he's appealing to the heart. So first it was to the mind, who Jesus is. Then it was to the will, how do I follow him? And what does that following look like? How do I decide? What decisions do I need to make? What's the cost of discipleship? And now it's to the heart. And in other words, what he's getting at now in this section of the book is, what's my relationship supposed to be like to this God, to this Messiah? And what is his desire from me? Who am I to him? Who is he to me? What is that relationship? What does a right relationship to God look like? And so here we are, right? Jesus is in the temple. We already talked about this last week. He's in the temple. He's in Jerusalem. And we're talking about heart, right? He's getting to the heart. This is the heart. This is the geographical heart, even the social heart of the nation. And he's appealing to the hearts of the people. And he is, if I could put it in a word, what he's doing right here and right now, he's renovating. He's renovating the heart of the temple. Physically, he came in and he moved the furniture. He removed the vendors. He's renovating. And he's renovating the hearts of God's people. He's setting up shop and he's teaching, right? And so one of the things that you have to understand, the dynamics that are at play in this moment as we head into this crucial passage, you don't get to renovate a place that's not yours. Right? If you don't own that, like I don't walk into Ashley Salyer's house and take a look around and say, you know what, the couch would actually be better over, and then start dragging the furniture if she has me over for dinner. You know, like that's not how, we don't do that. We know that. When Keston was little, having grown up here at the church, I think he felt like he kind of owned the place. Like this was like a second home. It's always been a second home. And I remember we were going to an event for the Young at Heart ministry, and he walks into the gym, looks around, and walks over to the corner, and with Ruth Tyson watching, he starts adjusting the lights. I think you were like 4 years old at the time. Starts adjusting the lights and is like, yeah, that's how I like it, and then goes to sit down. And Ruth kind of looks at me, chuckles, and then switches them back. Like, you have no right to, right? Like, we know this. You don't have the right to renovate. You don't have the right to push things around. And so here he is. He comes in and he cleans house. And if you missed last week, Jesus, he entered Jerusalem, entered on a donkey, fulfilling the prophecy of Zechariah 9:9. For the very first time, he publicly declares, I am the King of the Jews, by doing what he did. And on the first day of the last week before his crucifixion, he kicked out all the vendors, all the sacrificial animals, all the sacrificial system, and he replaces it with none other than himself. And he stands there where their sacrifices would have been just moments before. He stands in their place and starts teaching. And Luke chapter 20, verse 1 says he starts teaching and preaching the gospel. He takes their place. Actually, flip the page. Let me just give you a little context here. Turn the page to chapter 21, verse 37. Because Luke gives this kind of this summary statement that I think is helpful. It says in verse 37, chapter 21, verse 37, it says, and every day of that week, every day he was teaching in the temple, but at night he went out and lodged on the mount called Olivet. And early in the morning, all the people came to him in the temple to hear him. So this is exactly what's happening. And this is the context. So if you can picture in your mind what's happening. Actually, let me give you a little more context, because I think the magnitude and the scale of what's happening here is helpful. Like when I was a kid, when I heard that Jesus was teaching in the temple, the people were listening to him in the temple. For some reason, when I was younger, I had this picture that there were maybe like 50 or maybe even 100 people sitting there listening to him, and I probably got that image in my mind from either a photo that I had seen or like a Jesus film that I had seen or something like that, where they couldn't pay enough extras to actually fill the temple court. Let me clarify. When Luke says all the people are listening to him, I want you to picture this in your mind. The temple court is massive. It's 33 acres. It's huge. I think we've got 9 acres of grass here at Hilltown. So imagine this multiple times, at least 3.5 times as big as this property. And historians tell us that by the end of the Holy Week, it could host something close to 75,000 people in the temple courtyard. So when Jesus, this is probably Wednesday of the week, tens of thousands of people were in the courtyard. And Jesus is teaching, and all the people are listening to him, and they're hanging on his words. I think it's chapter 19:47 says, they were hanging on his words, eager to hear what he's going to say next, eager to see what he's going to do next. And from the other Gospels, we learn that even all throughout this week, he continued to do miracles. He continued to heal. He continued to cast out demons, even in this week and even in this place. So there was a huge buzz, a lot of attention. And it's been a couple of days, and the religious leaders have been absent for those couple of days. Why? Probably because they're trying to figure out, what on earth do we do with this man? Who on earth does he think he is? So, in a sense, Luke is showing us, this is the main theme of this entire section. Jesus has the right to take over. Jesus has the right to take over. If I were to say, like, this is what I want you to focus on, and even in your own heart this morning, because this is where it's going to go when you think about your own heart. Jesus has the right to renovate. Jesus has the right to clean shop. Jesus has the right to completely take over. And he's about to prove it. So, let's go to chapter 20, beginning with verse 1. Chapter 20, verse 1. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and preaching the gospel, the chief priests and the scribes with the elders came up to him. Now let me pause for just a moment there, because these three groups are pretty significant. The chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. These were the three groups, because I wouldn't naturally put this together. These were the three groups that made up something called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was the Jewish high court. It was like the supreme court of the Jewish people. So when you see chief priests, and the chief priests were they were retired high priests. High priests would only have one term. They would draw that term by lot, and once their term was over, then they would become one of the chief priests. So the chief priests, the scribes were the teachers of the law. They were the Torah lawyers, basically. And then the elders were representatives of the people. They were like the chieftains, the clan heads of the different tribes of Israel. So the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders, they made up the Sanhedrin. This was an official delegation. This wasn't just like a bunch of guys getting together and saying, hey, we should go talk to him. This was an official delegation sent from the official court of Israel, the Sanhedrin, sent to corner Jesus, sent to confront Jesus. So imagine, like, a couple of weeks ago, I was down at the Bucks County Courthouse for the National Day of Prayer. There were a whole bunch of people gathered on the courtyard of the courthouse, and there was a loudspeaker set up, there were tents out there, and we were praying, we were singing. Imagine if in that moment, a bunch of police officers organized, you could tell that they were organized, started approaching the person who was at the microphone. And with the police officers was the mayor and the mayor's office. And with the mayor and the mayor's office were a bunch of lawyers behind them with file folders under their arms or something. Imagine that kind of a scene. All dressed up, all in their suits, all in their official garb. People could identify and say, okay, that's a chief priest, that's a scribe, that's an elder of Israel. We know these guys. This is an official delegation come. And so you can imagine, if you're in the audience, if you're the crowd right now, you're seeing this happening, you're thinking, whoa, what is happening? Like, this is gonna go down, right? The tension suddenly increased. Things were already exciting. Now it's super exciting. The tension has elevated like crazy. So they came up and they said to him, verse 2, they said to him, tell us, by what authority do you do these things? Or who is it that gave you this authority? In other words, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Who gave you the right to remove the sacrifices? Who gave you the right, like to march in here like you're the king of Israel? Who gives you the right? Who do you think you are? By what, and this is the key question, by what authority? Who gave you this authority? And when you stop and consider the question that they just put to him, this really isn't a question, is it? It's a statement. They're not actually wondering who gave him permission, because they're the ones in charge. They're in charge of the temple. If anybody in the entire nation of Israel has the right to say, this is who gets to teach, this is who doesn't get to teach, this is what happens in this place, this is how these things happen, they're the ones who are in charge of the order of worship in the temple and around the temple courts. It's the Sanhedrin. So for them to ask, who gave you permission? They know they didn't give permission. This isn't a question. This is a statement. From their point of view, nobody has this right except for them. And so here comes this dude from Israel, this dude from Galilee, from no rabbinical teaching, no ordination, no commissioning, no right to set himself up as any kind of authority. He comes into their temple, their space. And they're thinking, you don't fit the bill. Like, we never gave you permission. This is our house. We call the shots. Who are you? Who do you think you are? How does Jesus respond? Verse 3. He answered them, I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven, which is another way of saying God, was the baptism of John from God or from man? And how did they respond? Verse 5. They discussed it with one another, saying, well, if we say from heaven, he will say, well, why did you not believe him? But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet. So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. So, okay, let's pause. Do you see what's happening here? Jesus is saying, all right, you want to talk about authority? Let's talk about authority. Let's figure out together who's in charge. And the beauty of this moment, it's so quick, it's so simple, and Jesus is just so brilliant in this moment. And the fact that he could accomplish what he just accomplished with a singular question it's brilliant. But there's so much irony in this moment. There's irony in the fact that Jesus never actually answered the question. There's irony in the fact that they actually did answer by giving him a non-answer and even answering the way that they did. They made it very clear what they thought of John's authority. It's also ironic because a rabbi, this is classic rabbinical behavior where you're asked a question and you respond with a question. Jesus, he's in full teaching mode here. They approach him, they ask him a question, they're attacking, but he returns a question back to them. But what happens in that moment is what just happened is they took the seat of the student and he took the seat of the teacher. And he took over the conversation and he proved who's in charge. He's controlling the dialogue of this entire thing. And he's proving his authority even by not answering by what authority he's doing these things. He's brilliant. And the fact that the leaders are trying to prove that they're in charge, but then also prove that they don't have the right to be in charge because they don't even know how to decide on and how to weigh out what happened with John the Baptist, this massive revival that just happened with tons of Israel turning back to God and faithfulness to God because of John's ministry. They don't know how to. They just publicly admitted, we don't know how to make sense of this. They just abdicated spiritual aptitude and authority in front of all these tens of thousands of people. And so Jesus is also accomplishing something significant here where he's starting to pull the thread of the network, this tapestry of spiritual leadership for the people themselves who are watching all of this. Jesus is helping them detach their confidence in this false leadership, this unworthy authority. And it's starting to unravel. And we're going to see this over the next couple of chapters, that their view of their current spiritual authority is starting to decay and unravel really quickly because of Jesus' consistent proof that they don't have it. So, beyond all that, you could say Jesus totally dodged the question. They asked him a question, he never answered it, and they never seemed to notice. But he does actually answer the question. What looks like an evasive change of subject is actually a fairly bold claim. Jesus, in his question, kind of intrinsically connects himself to John, which is appropriate. He is connected to John. John was connected to him, right? Their ministries go hand in hand. John, just like Jesus, John had no formal training. He had no formal authority. And just like Jesus, his ministry had this profound impact and started this revival. And John repeatedly and explicitly pointed to Jesus. In Luke chapter 3, in front of the chief priests, we read, John publicly described Jesus as more powerful than myself, one more powerful than I. And then he names him. He points to him and says, there he is. And the chief priests were there, watching that whole thing happen. So if John's ministry was from God, then they would have to admit Jesus' ministry could be from God. So he makes them publicly prove in front of the crowd that his authority is connected with the same authority that empowered John. And he flips authority in that very moment by making them answer to him, admit their ignorance, admit they have no right to judge since they're ignorant, and walk away having never gotten the answer that they were demanding of Jesus. So they had to go back to the Sanhedrin and say, we didn't get the answer that we were looking for. They were defeated in this moment. So who's in charge now, right? At the end of this paragraph, at the end of this quick interchange, who's in charge? Jesus is in charge. Friends, our tendency as human beings, our tendency is to put God on trial. And we do this over and over and over. As C.S. Lewis said, we want to put God in the dock. C.S. Lewis wrote a series, kind of a body of essays, and published it in a book, titled it, God in the Dock, meaning God's on the stand. He's being interrogated. He's being questioned. We put God on the witness stand. We interrogate him, and we make him answer our questions. We do it all the time. Like us created creatures, we tend to ask the Creator because we don't like what he's doing in the world. We see atrocities happening all over, and we don't like it, and we think to ourselves, how could God possibly allow this to happen? How could he be good? If he is there, how could he be good? If he's not there, then why is he making all these claims? Why are other people making all these claims? We put God on the witness stand all the time, or even in our own life. How could God, God, where were you when this thing happened? How could you possibly allow my marriage to go in this direction, or my child to walk off? Or how, God, please answer my questions. And we interrogate him, and we corner him. This is the human heart, right? And this is what C.S. Lewis writes in his collection of those essays. He says, ancient man approached God as the accused person approaches his judge. But for the modern man, and which we could say, this moment in history was very modern. We could relate to this. We could relate to what's going on with the Sanhedrin. For the modern man, the roles are quite reversed. He is the judge, but God is in the dock. The modern man is the judge, and God is in the dock. He is quite a kindly judge. If God should have a reasonable defense for being the God who permits war and poverty and disease, man is ready to listen. The trial may even end in God's acquittal, but the important thing is that man is on the judge's bench and God is in the dock. In other words, God's on the witness stand. He's the one being interrogated by our hearts. If we want our lives to change, like if we want God to renovate our hearts and change us for good, we need the one who's designed us to take over. We need to reverse this. We need to get out of the judge's bench and put ourselves back on the witness stand where we belong. We need to recognize that we never had any business on that judge's stand in the first place. And we need to start listening to the questions that God asks of us and submitting to the statements that he makes to us. It's scary in a way. It's kind of scary to see the Sanhedrin, the Jewish people, the representatives of God's people, so blind, so arrogant. But it's humbling to see that this is a picture, by God's grace, this is a picture of you. This is a picture of me in our worst moments. Jesus has the right to take over. He has the right to renovate our hearts. So the leaders asked Jesus, "Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to come in here and change everything?" Watch what happens next, because we're basically going to ask the same question. We're going to flip it, though. Well, look what happens next. Jesus, right on the heels of this moment, he turns to everyone who just heard that confrontation. So there's this group of delegates that are there. They're leaving with their tail between the legs, right? And he turns, although some of them stay, because we're going to see that in the next moment. And he turns to the crowd, these tens of thousands of people. He turns to them and starts telling this story. He makes up a story on the spot. And this story, it's loaded with images and actions that are, I would say, that are weaponized. They're volatile images and actions. If you know what he's getting at, if you know some of the hyperlinks that he is referencing in these moments. And it stings. And you know it stings because of how the leaders react in that moment. Look at verse 9. Let's read this together, and I'll stop along the way again. And verse 9 says, "And he began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while." Now, let me pause. Because I don't want, what Jesus just said, I don't want it to be lost on any of us. The moment he said, "A man planted a vineyard," that would have sparked something in their mind. The mention of a vineyard was a hyperlink, right? The mention of a vineyard, it was a hyperlink to a very significant and very familiar image to them, very familiar to the people of Israel. It's like if I were to say to you, there was once a great and terrible war that ripped up a nation and divided it in half into the north and the south. If I were to say just that, what event do you think I'm talking about? The Civil War. And what nation am I talking about, obviously? The United States. We're talking about us, right? So if when Jesus says a vineyard, so for the Jewish people, the moment you start talking about a fatherly farmer figure who planted a vineyard, it automatically reminds them of Isaiah 5 or Nehemiah 9 or many of the Psalms where in Isaiah 5 it says, "Let me sing for my beloved, my God, my love song concerning his vineyard. The vineyard of the Lord of the hosts is the house of Israel." They knew this, right? So Jesus isn't just telling some generic story about some generic vineyard. The moment he says this, they're all alerted. They know exactly what he's talking about. Verse 9, a man planted a vineyard and let it out to tenants and went into another country for a long while. He's talking about Israel, and everybody knows it. Verse 10, when the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants. Let me just pause here and just ask, do you think the people know who the tenants are? Just given what just happened just a second ago, that he's talking to the leaders of Israel, right? And now he's talking about this parable about the tenants, those who are in charge of, obviously, Israel, this vineyard. I'm pretty sure the people are making this connection. I hope you're making this connection, right? So sorry, let me get back onto it. Verse 10, he sent a servant to the tenants so that they would give him some of the fruit of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And he sent another servant, but they also beat and treated him shamefully. And he sent him away empty-handed. And he sent yet a third. This one they wounded and cast out. So, who is the vineyard? It's Israel. Who are the servants? Who are the servants? Who do you think the servants are? Yeah, the prophets. Right? The prophets that God sent to Israel. This is a major theme for Jesus. He was passionate about this. Back in Luke 13, back in Luke 11, Jesus said, the blood of all the prophets from the foundation of the earth is upon the head of this generation. Right? So he loved, like God, he's saying, this is passion. This is something very deeply personal to Jesus because he loved these men. He loved these men who gave their lives to take his message and to be forerunners for him. Right? To prep Israel and to call Israel back to repentance. Over and over and over again, God pled with Israel through these people, and Israel mistreated them, even beheaded them at times and killed them, strung them up. It's a marvel, just a side note, it is a marvel that God would send people into your life to confront you. It's a marvel that God would go out of his way to activate other people on his behalf to get your attention. And that sometimes we, just in our own arrogance and stubbornness, we don't see it. We actually think that it's like actually something that's adverse to what God would want for our life. We ignore it. Or we'll we'll silence it. We'll kill it. We'll shut it up. Whatever that voice is or whosever that voice is. So the vineyard owner has tried over and over and over, right? And I imagine if you're in the audience and you're listening to this, you're thinking, okay, man, the owner must be furious at this point. 3 servants that he's sent, and they've all been beaten up. He must be so mad, so offended. These guys, they have it coming, right? So what's he going to do next? Is he going to send soldiers? Is he going to have them arrested? He could. He obviously has more than 2 witnesses. What is he going to do next? Verse 13. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." And when Jesus says this, and when Luke writes this, my beloved son, for Luke's readers, that's us, as we've been reading through the book of Luke, we know that's a nod right there to Jesus' baptism. That's the exact same phrase that Luke recorded when God the Father spoke over Jesus and said, "This is my beloved son." He's making it explicitly clear that he is God's son. He has been sent to Israel. He is the one last chance, the one final appeal. So, how did the tenants respond to this time? Verse 14. But when the tenants saw him, they said to themselves, "Hey, this is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." I don't know how that made sense in their mind. I have no idea, but we'll keep going. Verse 15. And they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What a clear parallel to Jesus being dragged out of the city, being dragged out of Jerusalem, out of the city limits, and killed on that cross just days from now. So obviously, the tenants are working with some assumptions here, right? Like they're assuming that they're next in line. They're assuming that if we can get rid of this one person, we'll be in charge. We'll be the ones left. We'll be able to rule the roost. And they're assuming that the vineyard owner is either passive, that or powerless. He's off in some distant country, and he's not going to bother with us. We can do whatever we want over here. We can do whatever we want with this guy. I don't know where he is. He's been away for so long. I think he's asleep. I think he's gone. Maybe he's dead. But we don't care. He's no threat to us. This will now be ours. If we can get rid of him, this will now be ours. These were some of the assumptions that they're obviously working with. Verse 15. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy, that means kill. He will destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. Now here, this is what's fascinating to me. This is the crowd, the whole crowd, thousands of people, when they heard this, they said, surely not. Right? So they're shocked that this would be the outcome of Jesus' parable. Now, this isn't reality, right? This is a fictional story that Jesus is making up on the spot with spiritual truths behind it. Why are the people so shocked? There's shock all over the story. There's shock at the arrogant sin of the tenants. There's shock at the willingness of the Father to send his beloved Son, that he would be put in such a vulnerable position, right? There's shock, right? But mostly, and here, this is what it comes down to, is they're shocked because they're putting this together. They're shocked that the Father would give the vineyard to somebody else. He would say, okay, I want to give this to somebody other than the tenants of the vineyard, other than the spiritual leaders of Israel. I am going to give Israel away. The blessings of Israel are going to be given to someone other than Israel. Which is exactly what happened. You see this throughout the book of Acts. Luke, one of his jobs, one of his goals as he sat down to write the book of Luke and the book of Acts together was to show how the gospel went from Israel to everybody, almost everybody else. He's telling the story of the gospel as it busted out beyond the walls of Israel. And Jesus captures that right here in this parable. He's saying, so they're saying, Jesus, seriously? Like, you can't mean this. Like, God's going to give us away. He's going to give the blessings of Israel. He's going to give the vineyard away. How does Jesus respond? Verse 17, but he looked at them, he looked directly at them, which seems intense. He looked directly at them and said, what then is this that is written? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And then he interprets that phrase for them. He says, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. And when it falls on anyone else, when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. Here's what's amazing about what he just said. He's quoting from Psalm 118. He's quoting from the very same psalm that they were just quoting to him the day or days before as he was coming into the city, when they said, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Psalm 118. Jesus is saying, listen, you can't have one without the other. These things, this prophecy goes together. I'm the one. I'm the stone. I'm the cornerstone. It's going to get rejected. I'm right now, can you see it? I'm right now being rejected by Israel, by your spiritual leaders, by your heads. You're turning me away. They're turning me away. And here's the truth of it. If you stumble over me, you lose. And if you just punt and decide not to decide what to do with me, when I come back, you lose. That's what he says. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces. If you stumble, if you say, no, I can't get on board with this, you lose. And if you don't do anything, and I come back, it's going to crush you, pulverize you. The phrase that he uses here, when it falls on anyone, it will crush him. In verse 18, that's like a millstone crushing seed or crushing grain. If you're not on board with this, you lose. Friends, what Jesus is tapping into here is actually quite profound. He's challenging that condition of the sinful human heart that simply refuses to believe, even when the strongest of evidences is put before it. Like that, and there's something very real in the human heart. And I would say, in fact, to some of you who are here who are just watching from the outside, you're just kind of observing, like, what is Christianity? Maybe you're asking, what is Christianity? Maybe you're here because you've been invited by a friend. You don't want to be here, and you're like, I think this whole thing is baloney. I don't like it, right? Let me just challenge you here for just a moment, because I think what Jesus is tapping into is something really profound that is present in the human heart. It's not the absence of the right evidence. It's the presence of unbelief. Some of you some of you are here, and you've got your arms crossed, and you've got this posture of like, well, you've got to prove it to me. Nobody's actually proven to me. They've never proven the gospel to me. They've never proven the claims of Christianity to me. You've got to convince me. Come on, convince me, right? And some of you have that kind of posture. But what Jesus is tapping into here is saying, no, there's more to this. All the evidence might be out there. All the evidence in the world may be out there. And still you're not going to come along because of not what's missing, but because of something that's present. And the presence of this deep unbelief. Think of it like this. Aristotle was renowned to be one of the most brilliant minds ever to have lived. And he made a claim in his lifetime that if you dropped 1 pound of weight and 100 pounds of weight from a great height, which they didn't have back then, but from some great height, that the heavier object would fall faster. And after he made that statement, everybody pretty much said, okay, we're on board, you're smart, we're not, we'll take it, and they believed it. Galileo, hundreds of years later, brought an official delegation from local universities to the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he took a 1 pound weight and a 10 pound weight to the top, and he had somebody else, a third party, drop them as these scientists were watching and witnessing. And he dropped them at the same time, and they landed at the very same time. Today we would say, yeah, that's physics, right? Those are the laws of gravity. But that delegation was utterly convinced after multiple tries that there was a fraction of a difference, and came away writing in documentation that they were unconvinced by the evidence that Galileo presented to them, and something else would have to happen. And they've now made it official, the 100-pound weight, or the 10-pound weight in his case, wins. Think of Copernicus trying to prove, and actually being, I think it was Copernicus who was excommunicated from the Christian church at the time because of the heresy that he promoted, that the world, the earth, revolves around the sun. With all the evidence that was out there, we just refuse to believe. What Jesus is tapping into here is something really significant for the human heart. That it's not necessarily that there's evidence that is missing, that there's actually something that is present. And if you're here this morning, and that might be you. If you're here this morning and you know, yeah, I've never believed in this, I've never given my life, I've never trusted in Jesus. And if you're thinking it's because you haven't been convinced, then think again. Just ask, will you please ask this question of your own heart. Who has the right to renovate your heart? Who has the right to take over if it's not your designer, if it's not your creator, if it's not the one who thousands of years before this moment said, this is exactly how I'm going to come in, and that's exactly how he came in, who thousands of years before said, I'm like, this same one is going to be rejected, and then in this week, he was rejected. Here's another angle. Who do we think, who has the right to claim lordship? Sometimes when we think of submitting to authority, one of the problems that our human heart has is that we think it's unfair. We think, why should I submit and you not have to? And one of the beautiful things about this story that Jesus just told is that he claims and he ties himself to the Son who submits. The Son who submitted to the Father and made himself, I'm going to get choked up because I'm picturing Jesus coming to earth knowing that this is not going to go well for him, making himself vulnerable for these rebellious people. Who has the right to say, you can submit to me because I love you and I'm willing to submit for you? Like the problem with the human heart is that we are constantly trying to replace the king. And the gospel says the king replaced us. That he came as a son and laid down his life for your sake. Who on earth would not want to submit to authority like that? If you're here this morning and you're thinking, okay, this does make some kind of sense and I would want for this, then the terms of the gospel are strikingly simple. Where if you turn to God in faith and ask for forgiveness for rejecting his kingship and his lordship over your life, he will say, and he promises you, he will say, I forgive it all. If you're willing to let me be king, I forgive it all your rebellion. I forgive it. You were guilty in front of me. The debt that you owed me for your rebellion was so great, you could never repay it. But my son has paid for it for you by his very life. And now, your debt is gone. Your rebellion is over. I'm getting what I came for from the vineyard in you. Not because you loved me, not because you had any potential, but not because you tried hard, only because I love you and I chose you by my grace. But you have to submit to that loving authority. So, we ask Jesus, who do you think you are? Jesus tells this story, displays it for us, and says, who do you think you are? And who are you to me? Pray with me, will you? Jesus, you have the authority to do whatever you want. And we, Lord, we rebel, we buck against that authority over and over. And even those of us who are Christians, who have submitted our hearts, we still struggle. Every day we struggle to surrender and to find those areas, to identify those areas that we need to continue to surrender. Would you please, by your mercy, draw us in deeper and deeper into this process of exploring and finding those ways, those areas that we're just clinging to, holding on to, and not submitting to you. And help us to lay them down before you. I ask this in the name of Christ, our King. Amen.